Hey everybody, this is the second chapter from the part 2 of Ngô Van's In the Crossfire Adventures of a Vietnamese Revolutionary. Part 2 of the book is titled, I just don't know how to pronounce it, In the Land of Héloïse. The chapter's titled New Radical Perspectives. The chapter that was previous to this was titled Worker in the Promised Land. And as soon as I start reading, I start having a sneezing fit. So, Chapter 2, New Radical Perspectives. In 1948, my friend Nguyen Van Nam told me that when I got to Paris, I should contact Sonia Gantabert. Sonia ran the tiny Camé bookshop near the Carrefour des Gobelins in the 13th arrondissement. In his memoirs, he later described our first meeting, quote, "The shop door opened and in came a tall, thin Indo-Chinese man who had just arrived from Saigon and who, amazingly enough, had my address. This was the beginning of my long friendship with Van," end quote. It was he who received me for the packages of rice sent from Saigon. Rereading Marx, illuminated by the work of Maximilien Rubel, discovering the existence of the Councilist Republic of Bavaria in 1918 to 1919, and of the Kronstadt Revolt in Russia in 1921, and then seeing the resurgence of workers' councils in Hungary in 1956, led me to investigate new revolutionary perspectives and permanently distanced me from Bolshevism, Leninism, Trotskyism. I developed a total distrust of anything that might turn into a, quote, machine, end quote. The so-called, quote, workers' parties, Leninist parties in particular, are embryonic forms of the state. Once in power, these parties form the nucleus of a new ruling class and bring about nothing more than a new system of exploitation. In France, I found new allies in the factories and elsewhere among French people, colonized people, and refugees from the Spanish Civil War 1936 to 1939, anarchists and pumistas, who had gone through a parallel experience to ours. In Vietnam, as in Spain, we had been engaged in a simultaneous battle on two fronts, against a reactionary power and against a Stalinist party struggling for power. Since arriving in France, I had stopped taking anything for granted. Rather than merely following those who preceded us, I felt that we needed to go beyond them, to stand on their shoulders so we could scan more distant horizons. But how to do this? This and so many other questions that had continually gnawed at me were now finally answered in the lively, fruitful discussions with my new friend Sonia. Until then, in Paris, I had sometimes felt the isolation of a lone survivor as I looked back on my past in Indochina. My friends and I had not only fought against the colonial regime, we had striven for a radical social revolution, and in so doing we came up against other enemies. Most of our comrades in the struggle, if they were not massacred, imprisoned, or sent to the penal colonies by the French colonial regime or forced into exile, ended up being murdered by Ho Chi Minh's, quote, Communist Party. My encounter with Sonia helped me to understand and reassess my previous history. Scarcely 10 years had elapsed since the October 1917 revolution in Russia, when in 1927, at the age of 14, I had gone to Saigon to work and become directly aware of the oppressive reality of Indo-Chinese society. For me, like so many others, the Russian Revolution was a sign full of hope for a possible liberation. Yet even then, during those early years of my apprenticeship in life in revolt, the rare news that reached us from Russia sometimes contained disturbing features. Here too, oppositionist revolutionaries were being hunted down, and Trotsky had been forced into exile. Through the Third International, Stalin had was imposing a totalitarian policy that seemed to my friends and me to betray the most precious aspect of our revolutionary engagement, a fraternal internationalism among all the exploited of the world. Under those circumstances, confronted with the emergence of a regime whose full horror became glaringly evident with the Moscow trials, it was natural that our critique of Stalinism was initially oriented around the ideas and partisans of Trotsky. But since my recent departure from Indochina in 1948, if the hope and conviction of the necessity of overthrowing the despicable world order never left me, they were nourished by new reflections on Bolshevism and revolution. It was thus with great joy and relief that I met people who had passed through diverse experiences yet had ended up asking the same questions. Sonia introduced me to the Union Ouvrière Internationale, International Workers Association, a group formed in 1948 by militants who had broken with Trotskyism following the split of the Internationalist Communist Party just after the war. It's interesting. But there's another like libertarian, or maybe it's not libertarian, I don't know, libertarian group that broke from Trotskyism in France at this time. I wonder what their relationship would be to Socialisme ou Barbarie. Anyway, Sonny and I took part in regular meetings of this group in Edgar Pesch's small room at the 5 Rue Clavel in the 19th arrondissement. At these meetings, I came to know Jacques Gallienne, Sophie Moen, Lambert Dornier, Benjamin Paré, and Manuel Muniz. Wow, that's crazy. If you don't know, Benjamin Paré, I believe, was I can't even remember, but he was some kind of surrealist poet, and he was a collaborator with Grandizo Muniz, who's here named as Manuel Muniz. Manuel Muniz was the leader of the Spanish Trotskyists in the Spanish Civil War, the so-called Bolshevik Leninists. But when he moved away, he became more and more more inclined to break with Trotsky's degenerated worker state thesis and moved in a more libertarian direction, and was influential on at this time on Natalia Sedova Trotsky, and I think I've gotten the impression that his influence and relationship with her in like the late 1940s and early 1950s is what led her to break with the Fourth International as it began to embrace Stalinist revolution from above via conquest as a substitute for bottom-up a socialism from below based on worker self-activity. There's debates about how to understand Stalinism's new power as it conquered half of Europe, and the Fourth International. Instead of viewing these as like despotic, anti-working class, either state capitalist or bureaucratic collectivist states, they viewed them as deformed worker states, and that they were progressive in spite of themselves. And I think people like Paré and Grandizo Muniz rejected that, and so did Natalia Sedova Trotsky. Basically, there's letters on here from Natalia Sedova Trotsky resigning from the Fourth International, and that's basically her reasoning. I think another influence at this time would have been on her breaking with that would have been she had a relationship with Victor Serge. I think Victor Serge and her together wrote memoirs about Trotsky, because Victor Serge also ended up in Mexico with his son Vladi. So it's kind of crazy that I guess I should probably move to New York City or somewhere like that where I can meet these best minds of my generation, because can't go wrong meeting Paré and Muniz. So another group of people who went from Trotskyism to a more libertarian direction, just like Ngô Văn. There were other group members such as Marcel Pinetier, Mangano, and Bilbao, whom I never met. Some other people later joined the group, including 2 refugees from the Spanish Civil War, Agustin Rodriguez and Jaime Fernandez, and 2 of my Indo-Chinese friends, Look and Fuck. Edgar Pesch gave me copies of his Cahiers de la Pensée, again, don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, a journal that he published dealing with issues such as existentialism, Marxism, and the psychoanalytical interpretation of magic, as well as his book Freud et la psychoanalyse. Freud et la psychoanalyse. In issue 2 of its bulletin, La Bataille Internationale, the International Battle, the UOI criticized the Vietnamese Trotskyists in France for the slogan, quote, defend the government of Ho Chi Minh against the attacks of imperialism, end quote, which they had adopted despite the assassination of almost all their comrades in Vietnam by Ho Chi Minh's hired thugs. The Trotskyists who supported Ho Chi Minh were acting like a hanged man clinging to his rope. In the, quote, opinion section of the Trotskyist paper, Tiang To, Workers' Voice, October 30th, 1951, I scandalized the Trotskyists with my article on the Indochina War, signed Dong Vu. Quote, workers and peasants, turn your guns in the other direction. I was aware that most of the Trotskyists would pay no attention to what I said, but I couldn't resist telling them what I thought, which could be summed up as follows. The dynamic of the war against the colonizers had enabled Ho Chi Minh to develop a superior military force which he used to crush the other groups struggling against colonial reconquest, along with any other opposition, and to exert an absolute hegemony over the conduct of the resistance. His underground government had become integrated into the Sino-Russian bloc that was struggling against the Western bloc, so that the Indochina War was taking place in the context of the Cold War between the two imperialist blocs. I thought that the workers and peasants who had guns in their hands should fight for their own emancipation, following the example of the Russian workers, peasants, and soldiers who formed Soviets in 1917, or the German workers and soldiers' councils of 1918 to 1919. In the cities which were dominated by the French Expeditionary Corps and the French Expeditionary Corps' lackey Bao Dai, the Bao Dai government, the soldiers should be urged to turn their weapons against their own generals. In the countryside where Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh were keeping the poor peasants under the yoke of the landowners, those peasants who should revolt in order to realize their old dreams of liberation, exemplified in the 1930 to 1931 peasant Soviets of Nha Tinh. Again, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. Nghe-Tinh. The indispensable first condition for this utopia to become reality was an awakening consciousness among those who had been recruited to fight for the Bao Dai government or for Ho Chi Minh's underground forces. They had to realize that the soldiers on both sides were being duped. It was obvious that if Bao Dai triumphed, they would remain slaves of the bourgeoisie and the landowners. If Ho Chi Minh won, the workers and peasants would simply have changed masters, being at the mercy of a rapacious state capitalist bureaucracy as in China and Russia. The second essential condition for such a utopian realization was that the social transformation in Southeast Asia, the Southeast Asian corner of the world, would have to spark a chain reaction among other proletarians all over the planet. To this, the Trotskyists in France replied, quote, while we have certain political differences with the Ho Chi Minh government, we support it in the certain stage of resistance against imperialism, end quote. They should have added, quote, ... as long as Ho Chi Minh leaves our head on our shoulders, end quote. New section. It's a continuous contradiction of Trotskyism right there, especially Orthodox Trotskyism. And some people that are a little less orthodox, is that they support states that, if in power, let me put it this way. Max Shachtman once said one of his realizations when he turned against the degenerated worker state thesis, or began questioning the aspects of how the Trotskyist movement was approaching the Russian question, is that he had the realization to himself, he's like, should I support a state that, if they somehow came to power, would kill me? Right? I mean, that was the question, right? It's also interesting how, this is just an observation, another person who emigrated to France in this period was Cornelius Castoriadis, and he had a very similar experience. I think he was a little young, so was a little bit removed from some of it. I think he came to France on on like a scholarship or a grant for like international students. I don't know what his age is compared to Ngô Văn, but his experience with like his like firsthand awareness of the persecution of the left opposition by the Stalinists really dampened any illusions he might have had of Stalinism representing anything progressive. And we don't have that experience, but I think like knowing about the experience of the international left opposition, whether it be in Spain or Greece or China or Vietnam, is extremely important, and hopefully awareness of that can kind of move people beyond some of the hang-ups that they have about whether or not Stalinism was progressive or if the Soviet Union was progressive. I mean, I think a lot of people's politics comes from knowing about certain features of history. I think the Spanish Civil, like the first bit of like radical history I became fascinated with was the Spanish Civil War, and I'm not an expert on it now, but I remember when I was a young, in my early 20s, watching the Grenada, which is like I guess another broadcasting thing besides the BBC from the United Kingdom. That's what I always assumed it was. I don't know, maybe I'm talking out my ass. But they had the 6-part documentary on the Spanish Civil War, which is like really opened my eyes to a lot of the dynamics of leftism. And I've said this before, and I'll say this again, is like I think one of the most important books that a person could read if they were coming into contact with radical ideas for the first time would be George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia. Yeah. Sorry, talking out loud. New section. The UOI broke up in 1952, and soon afterwards, Sophie, Sonia, Lambert, Augustine, Pesch, Guy Perard, and I gathered into a new, less formal group around Maximilien Rubel. I have pieces by Maximilien Rubel on this channel, if you're curious. I also have pieces by Benjamin Perret, and well, I actually don't have anything by him. I have Marcel van der Linden's section from his book Western Marxism in the Soviet Union on the state capitalist theses of Perret and Muniz. Back to the text. I had already been familiar with Maxime's writings. In the Saigon Underground in the 1930s, I had struggled to understand the first volume of Capital in the Costas edition, a study that was interrupted in 1936 when the Sûreté confiscated my books. In France, I discovered Page choisie de Karl Marx pour une éthique socialiste. Selected passages of Karl Marx for a socialist ethic, edited by Maximilien Rubel in 1948. For an epigraph, Maxime had chosen an astonishing quotation by Marx himself, quote, "One thing for sure, I am not a Marxist," end quote. This inspired me to re-explore Marx during my first years in Paris, which helped me to get over my feelings of confusion and helplessness following the tragic events of 1945 in Saigon. I had thus already had a certain connection with Maxime even before I met him. Maxime noted that in the 19th century there were other thinkers contemporary with Marx, quote, "incorruptible and pitiless judges of their era," end quote, such as Soren Kierkegaard and Friedrich Nietzsche. Nguyen Anh Ninh, the revolutionary who had awakened my own consciousness in 1926 to 1929, had been strongly influenced by Nietzsche. These thinkers had espoused, quote, new sets of values, new reasons for living, new norms for acting, a new ethic, end quote. But Maxime stressed that it was Marx who had truly embodied the Promethean faith, quote, I hate all gods, end quote, and who conceived of life as a project of building a genuine human community here on earth. The Marxian ethic is characterized by its amoralism and by its essentially pragmatic approach. Like Spinoza, Marx brought man into the eternal cycle of infinite nature and assigned him the ideal of fulfilling his own total human potential. Marx also brought the utopian future into the present struggle. By becoming conscious of their own alienation, the workers become capable both of destroying capitalist society and of building a utopia, a society without a state, without classes, and without money. In the process of criticizing Hegel's political philosophy, Marx took an increasingly radical direction, to the point of transforming this critique into a pure and simple negation of the state. Although Marx never used the term, at its deepest level, his critique essentially amounts to anarchism. In his book, Marx Critique du Marxisme, Marx as a Critique of Marxism, Maxime quotes the following passage from Marx. Quote, all socialists recognize that, quote, anarchy, end quote, is the goal of the proletarian movement, that once classes have been abolished, state power whose purpose is to keep the great majority of producers in bondage to a small exploiter minority will disappear and governmental functions will be transferred into simple administrative functions. End quote. Fictitious splits in the International, 1872. Maxime repeatedly stressed and illustrated this essential sentence of Marx, quote, the existence of the state and the existence of slavery are inseparable, end quote. Maxime also stressed that we needed to become more familiar with the groupings that had been eliminated by the large official political and labor union organizations. Their ideas and actions had been completely smothered. It would be good to bring those positions back into view, if only to demonstrate that our own positions were part of a tradition, and that what certain groups seem to be discovering today was in no way new. We needed to translate texts of the IWW comrades, in particular Daniel de Leon, and of revolutionary syndicalists all over the world, Spain, Italy, Netherlands, Russia, etc., as well as the libertarian and anarchist documents of ancient China, cited by Etienne Ballas in Chinese Civilization and Bureaucracy. New section. In 1958, our study and discussion group, which later adopted the same name Council Communist Group, began to collaborate closely with ICO, Information et Correspondance Ouvrière, Workers' News and Letters, which was facilitating a, quote, regroupment enterprises, end quote, a link-up of workers from different companies. I think the ICO, I'm not exactly sure, but I think the ICO might have been, is the group that was Henri Simon. I think that might have been Henri Simon's group that emerged out of Socialisme ou Barbarie. But I am not certain. Maybe it's a different group. Maybe I'm talking out my ass. Anyway, this new formation aimed to bring together workers who no longer have any confidence in the traditional working class organizations, namely the parties and labor unions, which have become, quote, elements of stabilization and conservation of the exploitative regime. ICO seeks to create actual direct link-ups between workers to inform each other about what is going on at different workplaces, to announce labor union maneuvers, to discuss our desires and demands, and to mutually aid each other. This process of dealing with particular current problems inevitably leads us to call into question the present regime and to discuss general problems such as capitalist property, war, or racism. Each participant is free to express his views and remains free to act as he wishes within his own workplace, end quote. We took part in these reunions as ICO correspondents. Guy at the post office, Augustine in a photo engraving company, Lambert at the Chausson bus factory, and I at Juman Schneider, a company that manufactured electrical machines. New section. On the night of May 10, 1968, a social tornado swept through Paris. Paving stones were hurled at the CRS, National Riot Police, Students built barricades on Rue Gay-Lussac and around the Sorbonne. As Sophie and I passed the knocked-down trees near the Saint-Germain subway exit and along Boulevard Saint-Michel, we felt that a new force had emerged, rejecting authority of the current regime and the state itself. Panic-stricken, de Gaulle denounced the, quote, filthy rioters, end quote, before secretly flying off to the army base at Baden-Baden, the headquarters of the French-occupied sector of Germany, where he prepared for the possibility of crushing the May 1968 insurgents with military force. The Maoists from the École des Beaux-Arts carried banners proclaiming, quote, good weather comes after the rain, end quote. I shouted out, quote, how pathetic can you get? Here we are in the land of the Paris Commune, and you can think of nothing but reciting the Hunan peasant's little red book, end quote. From then on, I was persona non grata in the local action centers. They practically treated me and my friends as cops. I was working at the Jument Schneider factory. Students were calling for a general strike and coming to the factories in order to make contact with the workers. The CGT prevented the workers from meeting them, keeping the workers isolated in their factories and driving away the students. End of chapter 2, New Radical Perspectives. There's a piece on here about Ngô Van's experience of a factory occupation in May 1968. It's also on this channel. It's titled A Factory Occupation in May 1968. Funnily enough. Thanks for listening.